This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a loophole. It wasn't an oversight. It was strategy. One of the most respected car brands in the world built machines that could recognize when they were being tested and change their behavior to deceive. Not to survive, not to experiment, but to win. And for years, no one noticed. This wasn't a broken engine. It was a system that knew when to lie. In 2015, regulators in the United States made a strange discovery. Certain Volkswagen diesel cars behaved like two different machines. During emissions tests, they were clean. On real roads, they were dirty, extremely dirty. At first, no one suspected fraud. Volkswagen was a respected global brand. German engineering, precision, trust. But the numbers didn't make sense. The cars passed laboratory tests perfectly, yet on highways, their pollution levels were up to 40 times higher than the legal limit. Not a small error, not a coincidence. Investigators dug deeper. What they found wasn't a mechanical defect. It was software. Hidden inside the engine control unit was code designed to recognize when the car was being tested. When it detected a lab environment, the engine switched into a clean mode. The moment the test ended, the software turned off the controls. Performance increased, fuel efficiency improved, and toxic emissions exploded. The car knew when it was being watched. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a bug. Someone taught the software how to lie, and that decision would soon trigger one of the biggest corporate scandals in history. Years before the scandal exploded, Volkswagen had made a bold promise. It would dominate the American market with diesel cars. Not just any diesels, clean diesels. Powerful, efficient, and fully compliant with US environmental laws. For Volkswagen, this wasn't optional. The company wanted to overtake Toyota and become the world's largest automaker. The United States was the final obstacle. Diesel was the plan. But there was a problem engineers couldn't ignore. To meet US emission standards, diesel engines needed expensive hardware, larger filters, complex exhaust systems, and reduced performance. That would make the cars slower, less fun to drive, and far more expensive. Executives didn't want to hear that. Deadlines were set. Targets were announced publicly. Failure was not an option. Engineers were told to make it work. Inside Volkswagen, meetings grew tense. Emails turned sharp. Warnings were raised, then dismissed. One engineer later admitted, "We knew what the rules required. We also knew we couldn't meet them with the engine we had." The choice became clear and dangerous. Change the hardware and lose the market, or change the software and pass the tests. Volkswagen chose software, and with that choice, the line between innovation and fraud disappeared. Volkswagen didn't start by planning a scandal. It started with a workaround. Engineers were under pressure. Deadlines were approaching. Executives wanted results. So someone suggested an idea that sounded temporary and harmless. What if the engine could behave differently during emissions tests? Not all the time. Just when it mattered. The solution was software logic. Simple, elegant, and dangerous. The code monitored steering input, vehicle speed, engine timing, and wheel movement. When the pattern matched a laboratory test, the engine switched modes. In test mode, emissions controls were fully active. Pollution dropped. Numbers looked perfect. Outside the lab, the mode shut off. Performance increased, fuel efficiency improved, and emissions spiked far beyond legal limits. Internally, some engineers knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't optimization, it was deception. One later testified, "We didn't call it cheating, we called it a defeat device." Once the software worked, it spread quietly across models and years. Millions of cars shipped worldwide, each one carrying the same secret. At that moment, the scandal was already inevitable. Volkswagen had crossed the line. For years, Volkswagen's cars passed every official test. On paper, everything looked perfect. Regulators were satisfied, customers were happy. Then someone decided to test the cars. Outside the laboratory. In the United States, an independent research group began measuring emissions on real roads. No controlled environment, no warning, just normal driving. The results were shocking. Some Volkswagen diesel cars were emitting pollution dozens of times above the legal limit. At first, researchers assumed a mistake. They recalibrated equipment. They ran the tests again. The numbers didn't change. The findings were sent to regulators. Volkswagen was asked for an explanation. The company responded calmly. It blamed technical issues, software glitches, minor calibration problems. Nothing serious. Regulators accepted the explanation, at least temporarily. Volkswagen issued quiet updates and promised fixes. But the real-world tests kept telling the same story. Something inside the cars was behaving differently when no one was watching. What Volkswagen didn't realize was that the investigation was no longer routine. The numbers refused to stay quiet, and soon they would expose everything. By 2014, US regulators were no longer convinced. The explanations from Volkswagen weren't matching the data. The numbers were too extreme, too consistent. This wasn't a glitch. The Environmental Protection Agency and California regulators called Volkswagen in for meetings. They demanded technical answers, not marketing language, not promises, real explanations. Volkswagen stalled. Engineers spoke carefully. Executives avoided specifics. Each meeting ended with the same message: we are investigating. Behind closed doors, panic spread. Internal teams scrambled to find a fix that wouldn't expose the truth. Software updates were rushed. Hardware recalls were quietly avoided. The goal wasn't to solve the problem, it was to survive the next meeting. Regulators tested the updated cars again. Nothing changed. Real-world emissions were still massively higher than legal limits. The deception was still there. At this point, regulators suspected intent. Volkswagen was given a choice: fully explain the discrepancy or face serious consequences. The company asked for more time. That request would soon become its biggest mistake. By mid-2015, US regulators had lost all patience. Volkswagen's explanations no longer mattered. The data was clear. The behavior was deliberate. This was no longer a technical discussion. It was an investigation. Regulators demanded one final test, under strict conditions, with no advance notice and full access to vehicle systems. Volkswagen agreed. They had no choice. During the test, engineers watched in silence as the numbers appeared on screen. Once again, emissions were low in the lab and dangerously high on the road. There was nowhere left to hide. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Volkswagen finally admitted the truth. Yes, there was software. Yes, it detected test conditions. Yes, it altered engine behavior to pass emissions tests. The deception had a name, a defeat device. The admission sent shockwaves through regulators and executives alike. Years of denials collapsed in a single moment. One official later said, "They didn't fail the test. They designed the test to fail us." Within days, regulators prepared public action. What had been a quiet investigation was about to become a global scandal, and Volkswagen's secret was about to be exposed to the world. When the news went public, the reaction was immediate and brutal. Headlines exploded across the world. Volkswagen cheated. Software fraud. Emission scandal. The story spread faster than Volkswagen could respond. Within hours, investors panicked. Volkswagen's stock plunged. Billions in market value vanished in a single day. What had taken decades to build collapsed in minutes. Customers felt betrayed. Millions realized their clean diesel cars were never clean at all. They hadn't bought innovation. They had bought a lie. Dealers were overwhelmed. Phones rang non-stop. No one had answers. Governments around the world reacted. Investigations opened in Europe, Asia, and South America. What began in the United States had turned into a global crisis. At Volkswagen headquarters, emergency meetings followed one another. Lawyers took control. Executives searched for statements that could limit the damage. But there was nothing left to spin. One truth now dominated every headline. Volkswagen didn't just break the rules. It built a system designed to deceive. And the world was watching as the consequences began to unfold. As the scandal grew, attention shifted to one man at the top, Martin Winterkorn, Volkswagen's powerful CEO. For years, he had pushed the company to dominate the global market. Now, that ambition had a cost. Publicly, Winterkorn denied responsibility. He claimed he had no knowledge of illegal software, no awareness of deception. But inside the company, the story was beginning to crack. Engineers started talking, emails surfaced, internal documents hinted that warnings had reached high levels. The question was no longer if leadership knew, but when. Under massive pressure, Winterkorn resigned. Not in defeat, but in disgrace. His statement was brief: "I accept responsibility." It convinced no one. Prosecutors moved quickly. Investigations targeted executives, engineers, and managers. This was no longer just corporate fallout. It was criminal. For Volkswagen, the message was clear. The scandal had faces now, names, careers, and the real consequences were only beginning. The financial consequences hit Volkswagen fast, and they hit hard. Within months, the company faced lawsuits from regulators, class actions from customers, and criminal charges from prosecutors. The bill was just beginning. Volkswagen agreed to massive settlements in the United States, billions to buy back cars, billions in fines, billions in compensation, not for broken engines, but for broken trust. In total, the cost climbed past $30 billion worldwide. One of the most expensive scandals in corporate history, and the money still wasn't enough. Executives were charged, some were arrested, others faced prison sentences. Engineers who once hid behind code now stood in courtrooms. The software had consequences. Volkswagen issued public apologies. New leadership promised transparency. Reforms were announced. Ethics programs launched. But apologies couldn't erase years of deception. The message was clear to the world: lying at scale doesn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, the bill always comes due. After the fines were paid and the headlines faded, Volkswagen was still standing. But it was no longer the same company. Trust was gone, reputation damaged, every decision now questioned. Internally, Volkswagen rewrote its strategy. Diesel was abandoned. Electric vehicles became the future, not by choice, but by necessity. The company had lost the right to be believed. Regulators around the world changed the rules. Real-world testing became mandatory. Laboratory results were no longer enough. The loophole Volkswagen exploited was closed forever. Inside the industry, Dieselgate became a warning. Software was no longer seen as neutral engineering. Code could deceive, and code could commit fraud. Years later, lawsuits continued. Executives still faced trials, and every new revelation reopened old wounds. The scandal refused to disappear. Volkswagen survived, but it survived as an example, a reminder that when ambition outpaces ethics, technology becomes a weapon, and the damage lasts far longer than the lie itself. This story didn't end when Volkswagen admitted the software. It ended when the world realized how easy it was. No forged documents, no secret factories, just code. A few lines, written in silence, that fooled regulators, customers, and entire governments. Volkswagen paid the fines. Executives resigned. The scandal faded, but the system survived. And that's the real problem. Because today, cars, planes, banks, hospitals, all run on invisible systems we're told to trust. So the real question isn't why Volkswagen cheated, it's this. If software can lie perfectly, how many systems are lying right now, and we just haven't caught them yet?